All right, hi, and welcome to this first webinar that I hope this is first of many that I'm going to run, and this one's all about the biological approach, and this one's particularly for teachers. So I'll make other exam review webinars for students, but this one I think will be most helpful for teachers, especially new teachers. If you're new to IB psychology, if you haven't yet taught the course, if you're already using our stuff, you're familiar with Thematic. I don't know if this is going to be that much new to you, but it might. Never know. So what's it all about now? This is going to be a bit longer than my normal videos, so I'm going to do my best here. I've got my timer. I'm going to try and keep it to about 45-50 minutes. So if you don't have the time now, hit pause, bookmark this video, or come back to it later. If you do have the time, right, make yourself a pot of coffee and let's get cracking. What we're looking at here in this webinar is three essential things. First of all, what are we teaching it, why, and then some tips on how we can teach it. But the first one's really our focus, like what do we need to teach for the biological approach. So we're going to start with the basics and try and figure out what are some learning outcomes for each of the topics based on what's written in the guide. And then we get into the more specifics, the detailed stuff, looking at what I would recommend are some good topics and some good studies to use to hit each of those outcomes. And also we'll look at how we can teach the biological approach through criminology, which is a really popular unit in our thematic approach. And then finally a few tips. So this is what we're going to look at in the next 45 to 50 minutes. So I'm not really going to give that much of a plug. The only thing I would say is check out our store for new workshops. We're looking into running workshops for teachers. So if you found this helpful and you want to have a face-to-face with me, then that might be something you want to look into and ask your school about. So yeah. Now, this for new teachers, we're looking at three approaches in IB psychology. Right, three ways that we try and understand behavior: through biology, through social and cultural factors, and then finally through cognition. We have four options, and high level students will have two, standard level will have one. I recommend abnormal psychology and human relationships. They're the most straightforward in terms of understanding the exam requirements. Development can be a little bit of a landmine, although it is fascinating. And I think health is also a potentially good topic. It's pretty much very similar to abnormal in its structure. But abnormal and human relationships are the most popular, and there's by far the most resources out there for them. And then we have to look at research methods as well, and the internal assessment. So getting into the biological approach, what to teach, what do we need to teach, what are the concepts, what are the key questions we're trying to ask, and then how can we devise some learning outcomes based on that. So this is an overview of what the biological approach looks like. We've got the brain, three main topics: the brain and behavior, hormones and behavior. This has now become hormones and pheromones and behavior, and genetics and behavior. And then we have subtopics here, right? So yeah, these are just the content. It just means this is the more specific topic. And I think we can actually structure this in a slightly different way that might make a little bit more sense. One of the central question in the biological approach is, how does biology affect behavior? And that, so how does the brain affect behavior? How does neurotransmission, hormones, pheromones, genetics, how do all these things affect behavior? That's what we're looking at. If we look at evolution, we're looking at why does biology affect behavior, right? So the biology affects behavior because it helps us to survive. That's essentially the answer to that one. And then we flip it with neuroplasticity. How does our behavior affect our biology? That should be really, how does our behavior affect the brain? And finally, how do we know? Techniques to study the brain, they help us know these things, the answers to these questions, as do using genetic similarities and other research methods like experiments. So I would say that the biological approach can really be divided into these four pretty straightforward questions. And by framing the approach and organizing it in that way, I think we can start to get a better understanding of what it is we have to teach and what we want our students to understand. So let's look at topic one. Let's jump straight into the brain and behavior. The key question here is looking at how does activity in the brain affect our behavior, right? And how do we know? Okay, so technology now. This is what the guide states. One or more examples of a technological technique used to understand the brain and behavior can be used. Now, because the guide states technological technique, I would be focusing on MRI, fMRI, other pieces of technology. I was quite surprised to see some resources doing things like autopsies and postmortems, case studies. The guide explicitly states technological techniques. I would be sticking to technology. So yeah, and I think MRI and fMRI are the best. So really the key question here is how and why are those techniques used to study the brain? Okay, and I think it's important that we focus on those two. How are they used and why are they used? Right, if we can have answers to both of those, students will do really well. And so I think our learning outcome is essentially the same as what it was in the old curriculum, right? Discussing how and why they're used to study the brain and behavior. All right, localization of brain function. Now, from the guide, students should understand the concept of localization and how the function of different parts of the brain is determined, as well as the limitations of this model. So, how the function of different parts of the brain is determined. What do we get here? We've essentially got the same learning outcome as we had in the old course. How have one or more examples of localization of function been determined by research? That's the key question. I think the exam question is going to be something like explain one example of localization of function, or maybe outline, describe one example. That's what it would be. Yeah, and so really we want students to know what is localization, what's at least one example, and then how can it be shown in research, limitations. Neuroplasticity. This is a little bit trickier from the guide. It doesn't make it as explicit as what we need to know. But it does say neural networks can change developmentally over time or after injury. This is termed neuroplasticity and can be examined using one or more examples. Okay, there's a couple of things that have been cut out, but that's essentially what it says. So one or more examples of neuroplasticity, right? We have to understand what it is. And I think this is really, how can one or more examples of neuroplasticity be demonstrated by research? Again, I think that's the core question that students are going to have to answer here. They have to describe neuroplasticity, an example of it, and then using studies to show that. Going further in essays, of course, offering some critical thinking towards that. Neurotransmission, really straightforward. Straight from the guide, one or more examples can be used to illustrate the effect of neurotransmitters. Okay, the effect being the effect on behavior. So real straightforward question, how can one or more neurotransmitters affect behavior? So we see with these things like hormones, neurotransmission, we're going to see this pattern coming up that it is pretty much explain how one or more affects the behavior. And I think hormones, I think a better title for this would be chemical messengers, but we've got hormones, including pheromones. Then we're looking at how might chemical messengers like hormones and pheromones affect behavior. Okay, and so again, we're looking at understanding behavior through these biological factors. So straight from the guide, the effect of a hormone on human behavior can be examined using one or more examples. Now, in terms of the IB guide, it has a lot of limitations, to say the least. But the biological approach is actually quite good. It has these little nuggets. It has these little gold nuggets that it just states exactly what you want to do. I won't rant too much about the guide, but it is rather frustrating that they've removed the learning outcomes, but they still exist. They've just kind of tried to hide them amongst everything else, because I believe the reason for that is they didn't want students to be memorizing exam answers based on the learning outcomes. They found that the learning outcomes made the questions too predictable, so kids were memorizing exam answers. So they've tried to make it not as clear what the outcomes are. But for many reasons, that's just not a great approach. But I think that's why we're finding these little short little quotes like this that tell us exactly what we need to teach, i.e. learning outcomes, being hidden amongst all this other fluff. So if you go through the guide, you can find them, especially in the biological approach. The other approaches aren't as helpful, I don't think, in doing this. And yeah, so really what we're looking at, same as neurotransmitters. How can one or more affect behavior? Pheromones, same thing, although this is a bit tricky. The arguments for and against the influence of pheromones in human behavior can be assessed critically using one or more examples. So, really, it's the same as we say, how might one or more putative pheromones affect human behavior? Now, I think this is a good word to use here, putative. You often find this in the literature when they talk about pheromones, meaning that it's reported to be a pheromone or reported to be a human pheromone, but they can't call it a human pheromone because there's too much controversy and debate around that issue. So putative means it's reported to be a human pheromone. And we're just simply adding an element of doubt here, right? I mean, how might, right? How could it? We'll get into the exam requirements later, but if we think short answer responses, they're not going to weigh both sides of the argument because there'd be evaluation critical thinking. So they are going to explain the one possible effect of a pheromone on behavior. Yeah, so a learning outcome here I think is to discuss the possible effects of one or more putative pheromones on human behavior. Now we get into genetics, the third topic in the biological approach. How might genes influence human behavior, and how do we know? Okay, so I think this is, again, pretty straightforward. So for genetics, under this topic, the link between genes and behavior can be studied using one or more examples. Again, we see that one or more examples, and I'll come back to that a little bit later about why I'd always go for the one example and not more, especially when it comes to exam revision. And a key question, I think, how can one or more genes affect human behavior? Now, unlike hormones and neurotransmitters, where they do say, one or more hormones, one or more neurotransmitters, the guide doesn't really say one or more genes, but I think it's beneficial to focus on specific genes. I think it just makes it easier for students to understand in terms of the rest of the biological approach, and I think it allows for more depth of explanation if you're actually explaining the role of the gene and how it relates to other processes like hormones and neurotransmitters. You can actually clearly explain the link there between the specific gene and the behavior. And there's nothing to say they wouldn't ask. I mean, if they just say genetics, yeah, why would they? There's nothing to say that they might not say one or more genes. They probably won't because it has been done in the past guides, but I think it's a good way to do it. Okay, genetic similarities. Now, this is a tricky one, and no one really knows how this is going to be worded in an exam, and it is pretty difficult to think of good exam questions based on this. And in fact, the IB psychology coordinator at the time of writing the guide said that this wouldn't be an examinable topic by itself, but then they later changed their tune on that, so we do have to prepare to write exam answers on this topic. I think from the guide, students should have an awareness of how the degree of relatedness between MZ and DZ twin siblings, parents and children, and parents and adopted children provides a critical perspective of valuing twin or kinship studies. What's the exam? What are we looking at here? How and why do researchers use twin and or kinship studies to understand links between genes and behavior? I think that's what we're looking at. Because this degree of relatedness is a little bit superfluous. I mean, the idea of, if they understand how and why twins or kinship, so for example, adoption studies, then, or relationships between parents and children, then this degree of relatedness is suggested in that question. So I think the learning outcome here is discuss the use of twin and or kinship studies to understand links between genes and behavior. Right? Why do we use twin studies or other similar studies? But this is a messy topic. So evolution. The guide. Evolutionary explanations for behavior can be studied using one or more examples. That's what it says. So how can one or more human behaviors be explained from an evolutionary perspective? I think that's the core question here that we want students to be able to answer. And so our learning outcome becomes pretty simple. Discuss one or more explanations, evolutionary explanations of behavior. So for the three topics, the brain and behavior, hormones, and genetics, students have to understand how and why one or more methods are used to study those. And also the relationship between ethical considerations and those particular research methods. All right, so that kind of underlines the whole approach. Now, in the old guide, it used to be that they just had to understand the use of research methods and ethics in the whole approach. Or the whole level of analysis. Now it's been changed, so we've been told technically they could be asked about methods and ethics in relation to the specific topics. So as much as possible in the revision book I've made, and in my course and other materials, I've really tried to overlap it as much as possible because I think that's a horrible addition in the amount of content. Explaining true experiments, explaining experiments in genetics, for example, is very different than hormones or the brain. So they've needlessly added a lot into it by linking it with topics and linking research methods and ethics with topics and not the whole level of analysis or approach. But we can work around that. We can find the overlaps to make it as easy as not as easy, but to make it as clear and straightforward as it was in the old guide. Now I think I'll do a whole other webinar on the extensions because there's a lot to go over here. But basically, for high level students, they have to understand the role of animal research in relationship to those three topics in the biological approach: genetics, the brain, and hormones. And these are the three things here: the value of animal models in psychology research, whether animal research can provide insight into human behavior, or ethical considerations. And I'll look at later how we can condense that and make it much more straightforward. Yeah, so this is for all of those three topics: genetics, hormones, and the brain. We need to look at animal models in relation to these 3 bullet points. All right, what to teach. So for exam prep, now let's look at some specific examples that we can do for prepping for the exam. What we need to be able to have our students be able to do in terms of the exam. So for short answer questions, this is paper 1, part A. There'll be one mandatory question based on the biological approach, right? There'll be one from biological, cognitive, social, cultural. 3 questions, 3 short answer questions, about 1 hour, so about 15 to 20 minutes per question, which equates to about 250 to 400 words. And they're definitely going to have one biological question they have to answer. Now, good short answer questions, and I'll try and link somewhere here my other video explaining how we can answer any short answer question, but I think it has a central argument. And then this is followed by a study. So our introduction simply states our central argument and the study we'll use. We get into the argument, the study, and then the conclusion wraps it up in a sentence or 2. I would say the central argument would be a 100 to 200 word explanation of the topic. And why this is important to know, we're just doing a little bit of backwards planning here. If we know, right, okay, 100 to 200 words is what they need to know, that now I know how much depth, I want to go on with my teaching, and how much, how much to cover, so they'll have enough to write about, but they won't be so swamped with content that they could write a 10,000 word essay on it, but they only need 1 to 200 words. So that's going to allow us to alter our content based on the requirements. So I think about that 100 to 200 words, and the same for the study, about a 1 to 200 word explanation of the study. And this is why I don't often introduce my students to the full original articles. Some people do. That's great, but I don't, because I want them to understand the concepts and be able to explain the study. I find reading the originals is, for a lot of my students as well, it just goes beyond their reading levels as well, because they're often very tricky, especially in the biological approach. So let's have a look at an example. Let's say the question was hormones and behavior. Well, the central argument would be how the hormone affects behavior. And that would be similar for if it was about neurotransmitters. How does the neurotransmitter affect the behavior? How does the hormone? How does the gene? How does the pheromone? How do they affect the behavior? And this is what's missing in most student answers. They don't actually have that argument. They just know the studies and they regurgitate the studies. But we actually want them to understand the behavior and the relationship between the biology and the behavior. If the topic was neuroplasticity, then it would be a 1 to 200 word explanation of the example of neuroplasticity, maybe why it occurs. If it was localization of function, okay, what does that word mean? What's the part of the brain? And then getting into the study, okay, how do we know that? 1 to 200 word explanation of how the hormone affects the behavior. Sorry, I made a mistake there, but that's that would be what it, so for the topic. And this is why I don't bother about command terms. The command term is actually, I think, the least important part of any IB psychology exam question. The more important part is the rest of the question, right? And students often don't answer the rest of the question. So wasting time on command terms, it doesn't matter. If this was suggest or identify one example of a hormone effects on behavior, or explain, describe, outline, the answer looks the same. And why is that? Well, because they're psychology students, and we want them to be able to explain behavior. And so we're not tripping them up with command terms to try. Why would we try and trip them up with command terms? We want them to be able to explain the behavior via the biology. In other words, how the biology affects the behavior, and then show how they know that using the study. The command terms are relevant. If we look to an essay is very similar to the short answer question. We've got the argument, the evidence, and then we just throw counter arguments and probably another study or 2 to beef it up, and because we have more time. So I would say the essay should be about 800 to 1,000 words. If you've got high flyers, they might be able to write more than 1,000, but I like to have realistic goals that all my students could meet. And so, the central argument would be, again, the same as exactly the same as a short answer response. And then for the study, you would just add another study, right? So you're looking here at about 600 words. And then your counter arguments, I think rule of 3 for counter arguments, 3 different points is pretty good. And also think, I'll link again here my 3 rules of 3s for essay writing. But I think a third study. So if you're in your counter argument, if you can introduce a third study, it's going to be advisable. So why am I going over this? When you're teaching, if you're prepping your students to write essays in the biological approach, well, then you want them to have at least 2 studies. If you're thinking, I don't want them to write essays about biology, they'll write about cognition, then you just focus on 1 study per topic and spend your time elsewhere. Right, so the essay would be, the central argument, the studies, and the counter arguments. Now, of course, it might not necessarily be in the structure, but these 3 things will have to be in the essay in order for it to get top marks. The central argument shows knowledge and understanding. That's criterion B of the rubric. The evidence shows the use of research, and the counter argument shows critical thinking. Again, here I will link my explanation of how I apply the rubric, the new rubric. All right, some exam tips. I would prepare 1 short answer response for all topics, because biological, cognitive, social, cultural. So in the core approach topics, in those 3 approaches, biological, cognitive, social, cultural, there's definitely going to be a question from each of them. Definitely going to be 1 short answer question from each of them. So they have to know, they have to be able to answer, right? 1 central argument plus 1 study for all those topics. Then I would choose just 1 of those approaches to prepare for the essay. Because for the part B, in the essay of paper 1, you've got, they'll have a choice. 1 question about biology, 1 about cognitive, 1 about social cultural. So they definitely know there'll be a biological essay there. So I recommend that they prepare to write the essay from the biological approach, and they have the cognitive approach as a backup, and then the social cultural approach is taught only at short answer response level. The reason for that is the social cultural approach is really hard to predict what the exam questions might look like. There's a lot of possibility for curveballs in there. In the biological approach, they're very predictable. Pheromones and genetic similarities are the only kind of iffy ones. And also, I think the critical thinking, I think there's more chance for students to show deeper understanding in the biological approach. The biological approach topics can be used in lots more parts of the course, so that can double up. The exam questions are more predictable, and I think it's, and the counter arguments, the critical thinking, I think is more straightforward in the biological approach, potentially. Having said that, a lot of students prefer the cognitive, so I always give my students a choice. If writing essays for the biological approach, I would also encourage using counter arguments from other approaches. So, for example, I focus on the biological approach in terms of my criminology unit. So we're looking at violence and aggression. And if we're saying discuss the effects of, say, neurotransmission on behavior, well, then my students can write about serotonin and its links with aggression. But then they can say, well, but hang on, aggression could also be a result of observational learning using social cognitive theory in the Bobo study. Or they might say, they could say it could also be social identity theory. Those factors there could also affect violence and aggression. So I think using those as counter arguments is a really good idea, because it shows students understand, hey, look, it's biological, but it's also these other possible factors as well. And because students have to study these topics anyway, it's not adding to the content. They're just applying the content in more ways. Similarly, they can also use topics from the same approach as counter-argument. So, for example, if the question was discussing the effects of hormones on behavior, and they wrote about testosterone and aggression, they can say, but it's not just testosterone. It can also be culture, like the culture of honor, or it could also be the damage to the brain. It could be serotonin, it could be genetics, it could be a range of biological factors. It's not just one. And so that's good stuff to put in their counter arguments to show their critical thinking. In other words, to show their understanding, the depth of understanding of psychology, that it's not just one approach that can explain behavior, but we have to consider multiple. All right, now let's get into some specific examples and some specific studies to look at when approaching these topics. And generally speaking, what I've recommended here are the topics regarding aggression and violence mainly that come from my criminology unit. If you're using my textbook and the other resources, you'll know that the PTSD section also has it does the whole biological approach again. But I would leave that. I'm not recommending that here because not all students will do the PTSD section, and I think the aggression stuff might be a little bit easier for most students. But definitely, there's lots of material in the PTSD stuff that they can apply. This is just my recommendations, and sorry, this is just some ideas. We'll come back to technology. I think that's easier to look at the end once we've done all the examples. Okay, localization of brain function. I would look at the amygdala and its role in experiencing fear and triggering the stress response. And we can look at SM's case study and the study RC et al. This was women with phobias, and they found that when they were looking at the thing they were afraid of, their amygdala was more active. I think these are two really good studies to show that the amygdala has that role in not only perceiving threatening stimuli, but also triggering the stress response. Critical thinking we can look at here is neuroplasticity. Functions of the brain can change, so they're not permanently in one function. Also, the brain is reliant on projections to and from other parts of the brain, so they're not just working in isolation. So the brain's function in one behavior is not just that one part of the brain, it's multiple parts of the brain. And of course, limitations of the studies. So I think that would be, I would look at, for essay writing, if they could do all this in an essay, I think they'd have a very, very good essay. Neuroplasticity. I think a good one here is looking at deprivation and childhood deprivation on the brain. And if you like teaching developmental psychology, and this topic is one as a dad of a toddler, this fascinates me. Rosenberg and Bennett, the rat study, remaining orphans, and Luby et al. I think these are three really good pieces of research to look at in terms of how our environment as a child can affect our brain. I think Luby et al.'s is perhaps can offer the most explanation and detail in that. And yeah, I won't spend too much time summarizing each of these studies. I'm going to assume that people know them, or if not, they can look them up. And also, these will all be summarized in the revision. Or they are summarized in the revision textbook. Link in the description. So yeah, and they're all also in my normal textbook, so you can look them up there. If I try to explain all these studies now, yeah, we'll be here for a long, long time. So I'll just state them, and then they can be looked up later. Critical thinking. So contradictory evidence. What I think one of the good ones is, what are the applications? Why is this valuable to know? And the limitations. I mean, that just goes without saying. And honestly speaking, students can talk about limitations with studies regardless, in an essay, regardless of the question. I never realized that. I always thought it should be rather relevant to the question, but I was very surprised this year marking paper 2, and in a question about explaining etiologies of a disorder, a student critiqued the study or questioned the ethics in the study and said, why it might not have been ethical. And I'm thinking, wait, ethical considerations in the study, how is it relevant to explaining the etiologies? But the chief examiner, that was a seed, and the chief examiner gave them credit for it. So I think showing critical thinking perhaps is more important than the relevance of the critical thinking, which was that was news to me. Okay, neurotransmission. I like serotonin and its influence in antisocial behavior, and because we can see serotonin's role in the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, and these are two parts of the brain that can be used throughout the biological approach. And there's a couple of good studies here. That this is Passamani's study is a good one for that, showing the effect of serotonin on the brain when confronting threats. Critical thinking, alternative explanations. So by that, right, is aggression just the serotonin, or can be hormones, etc., and limitations and applications. Why might this be useful to know? Hormones. Again, looking at aggression, and again looking at impulsive reactive aggression, because we're looking at the connection here between things like serotonin and testosterone and the warrior gene on the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. So the impulsive part is because of the low function of the prefrontal cortex, which is suggested by the role of serotonin and testosterone, and the reactive part is the high activity in the amygdala. So Albert et al. Study is an animal study, and then rare case study is a very good human study to use. Now, this can be really tricky, and it is very tricky. So, in the emotion and cognition unit, I talk about, my students prepare to write about stress and the release of cortisol and how that affects memory. And so for students who aren't quite capable of explaining this, so anyone who you're not expecting to get a 6 or a 7, so if you're thinking a 5 would be a great achievement for them, I would encourage them to talk about cortisol and memory or something else. I think perhaps this could be a little bit too tricky. Having said that, the Albert L study is really basic, so they could just say testosterone and aggression and summarize the animal study, and they could get medium marks for that. Again, alternative explanations. What are the other factors that could affect aggression? Areas of uncertainty, and the study limitations. So thinking about things like, this takes place in fMRI. They didn't actually measure aggression. The rare case study, they just measured brain activity. I'm trying to think of what I was thinking about with areas of uncertainty. Where does the high testosterone come from? Right, so we don't get these injections for people. So what are the factors that affect levels of testosterone? And that's where you can introduce, or students could bring in the culture of honor study for that one if they've done that. Pheromones, I like androstenedione, and because it works in a similar way to testosterone in terms of attraction. And so what we're looking at here is androstenedione might. There's studies where during speed dating, participants exposed to this will rate males as being more attractive than those who aren't exposed to the androstenedione. And another study suggests why that is. It could be because it's working like testosterone in that it signals healthy and strong genes, right? So it could be how that's working. Critical thinking, is there contradictory evidence? And other explanations. So if we're looking at attraction, we're not just these beings that are dictated by chemicals, but we can actually, the way that we think and our cultural upbringing might affect who we're attracted to and how we feel about someone else, and always limitations of the studies. Okay, genetics. I like looking at the worry gene and looking at the monoamine oxidase A and the variations of the genes that that gene that has a low expression, so it's sending less signal out of the cell. So they're collectively known as the L variant, and that has been connected with aggression, and that could be explained because of its effect on the prefrontal cortex. We can see that in fMRI studies like Meyer Lindenberg's, when we look people with that variant and they're seeing threatening faces, they have less activity in the prefrontal cortex than other people, right? And so if we have less activity in our prefrontal cortex is the brake on behavior. So if we're seeing this, someone threatening us, coming towards us, and we want to defend ourselves, our prefrontal cortex might say, hang on, you might get in trouble. If you have low activity, you don't really have that brake, so you might just act on impulse. And so that understanding that role of the prefrontal cortex is really, it's pretty basic, but it can help, and it does help explain other topics like neurotransmission and serotonin, neurotransmission and hormones. And that's why I like it. I like that students can be going really, using the prefrontal cortex, using other parts of the brain to explain things like genetics and hormones. They can show a really deep understanding, but it's the same for all of the topics. So it's not all this new, it's not a whole heap of new material, but it's building their understanding upon each topic. Critical thinking is, right, it's not just genes that affect aggression. We know it's a whole bunch of other things as well. Areas of uncertainty. Why does that variant have a low effect affect the prefrontal cortex? How do we get from not expressing enough from the genes from the cell, so we have less of the enzyme monoamine oxidase A working in the synapse to break down the neurotransmitters? Why is it going to have less effect on the prefrontal cortex? And so there's a few questions there and that's really advanced critical thinking. So I wouldn't expect all students to be able to raise those questions, but yeah, most of them will try and talk about the limitations of the studies. All right, genetic similarities. What I would say here, the key answer, how and why these are used, they can control for either genetics or environments as the factors to study aggression. So, if we're looking at an adoption study, then, it depends if they're identical twins raised together or apart. we can, because identical twins have 100% of their DNA, then we're controlling that, saying, okay, it's not genetics, it must be the other factors that are influencing behavior. And so Rain Baker and Grove et al., these are two studies that are to do with aggression and that use those methods. Okay, so evolution and behavior. I would say that a good one here is fear, and the idea that we've evolved to fear things that are dangerous. So the behavior looking at is fear, and also not only fear, but also the activation of the stress response when we're feeling scared. And that fear triggers that stress response, and that helps us to deal with the danger, and that will help us survive. All right, so we see something we're afraid of, amygdala activates, triggers the HPA axis, we get our adrenaline and cortisol pumping, now we're ready to fight or flight. Right, and that's going to help us survive, pass on our genes. That's why we've evolved to have that behavior. That behavior has been naturally selected, or that process in our brain has been naturally selected because it's going to help us survive, and the genes that allow that to happen, that program for that to happen, have been passed on. I think SM's case study is a good one to look at, and a key detail there for her case study. This is a woman in her 40s who had amygdala damage due to a genetic condition and can't feel fear. Her life's been in danger several times, so they report, and she's been held at knife point. She doesn't avoid dangerous places, dark alleys, walking home at night, and she's been, I think, in abusive relationships, possibly because she doesn't have that fear. So she's almost continually putting herself in danger. She doesn't have a healthy fear response, so that can show us that if we don't feel fear, we might be in danger. And ours et al. Study that I talked about earlier, when we have women who are different types of phobias, like snakes and spiders, snakes and rats, I think it was, and depending on what they're looking at, when they see the thing they're afraid of, their amygdala activates. And so we know that, right? Our amygdala activates when we feel. That's evidence that our amygdala activates when we feel fear. It's going to trigger that stress response and help us deal with that stimuli. Now, the technology I would look at here is fMRI. And I think it's pretty simple, but it allows students to have a really good explanation where how they're used. Well, we put participants in the fMRI machine, and then we manipulate their physiology in a way that we hypothesize is going to affect their brain activity, and the fMRI measures that brain activity while they're performing some sort of task. 2 or 3 sentences there, pretty basic. And then that's the how, the why. So that way we might be able to explain how that physiological factor, like the hormone, neurotransmitter, or the gene, how that might affect behavior through its function on the brain. So they allow us to look at the brain maybe as a mediating or moderating variable that is explaining the relationship between things like genetics, neurotransmitters, and hormones on the brain. So a couple of studies. So Radke study on hormones, Passamone study, and even Meyer-Lindenberg studies, one where they didn't manipulate it. That was the genetic study, but they can see the result of different. So you're looking at the experimental method, but they haven't altered their physiology, but they're looking at different types of physiology and how that might affect the brain. Critical thinking, so construct validity. If we're thinking they often use the same experimental paradigm where they have the face threatening or different types of emotions on faces as they're watching. So you have angry face, happy face, sad face, and they look at it and then they measure their brain activity. Now, they're often designed to mimic different types of human interactions. So the angry face is often about confronting social threat. But is that similar to what happens in a real life? Is that representative of actually being in a physical confrontation where you've got lots of people around watching you? There's a whole physical person in front of you there. Also, they're measuring the brain activity. So we're not measuring aggression, and we can't do that at this stage. We will be able to in the future. So there's that issue there that kind of goes along with ecological validity, right? How much does this reflect what's happening in real life? So that probably is more ecological validity than construct validity, the explanation I just gave. The construct in this instance probably being social threat. So is what they're manipulating, is that really social threat? Okay, research method and ethics. I would focus on I'd focus on the experimental method, and I'd typically, especially for brain activity and pheromones, be looking at true experiments. So where, and because it's kind of easier to explain, and it's a little just a bit more simple for students. So biological variables are manipulated, control conditions, cause and effect relationships can be drawn. Okay, and I think I would add to that with the fMRI studies. So the explanation is really pretty similar that the one that we just had about fMRI studies, but we're focusing on the true experimental method, and the fMRIs are used as part of that. Okay, and so we can use those same studies that we've been using throughout. Now, for the experimental method for genes and behavior, I think looking at animal experiments would be good for high level students. Stand level students, I mean, this is why it gets really tricky. What research method is a twin study? Is it correlate? IB considers it correlational, but I think that's really tricky for students to understand. They're not considering twin studies or adoption studies to be research methods per se, which I think is just a nuisance and nonsense. So genes and behavior, I would be encouraging high level students to use any their animal experiments for this one. You know, like if they talk about knockout genes and things like that. And for stand level students, I might even be tempted to get them to read about those at least one or two studies based on that, and then they can use that animal study for the genes and behavior in their other response as well. But you can see I struggle with this one, genes and behavior and the research method. It's tricky. There's no easy answer for that one. Okay, ethics. What we're looking at here is linking the ethical consideration with the research methods that we've just talked about. And so I would say informed consent would be a really important one to look at here. If we're manipulating variables like hormones and neurotransmitter levels, this might have negative side effects. We probably need to tell people. And we have to think about when we have to tell people. Might also talk about oh, I think that's something from before. This should have been on the slide before. Biological variables, right? So if we're going to manipulate people's biology and put them in an fMRI and tell them and measure their brain activity, then we probably want to get their informed consent. Also, we're going to measure people's brain activity. What's happening in our brains, pretty personal, could be sensitive. We want to let them know that that's what we're going to do. They're getting in an fMRI, that can be really uncomfortable, can take a long time. So again, we want them to know about that before they join the study. So we can see we're linking that, why that informed consent is important to reduce the negative effects of the study on the participant. And that's the crux of ethics. And what students are explaining with ethical considerations is, what does the researcher have to do in order to minimize the negative effect on the participant? I think that's a pretty good way to look at it. And so when we think of ethical considerations, we're looking at ethical guidelines like informed consent. Okay, what do they have to consider about informed consent in order to reduce the negative effects on the participants? Okay, so the high-level extensions, I'll have a whole nother slide where I go over this. And actually, while I'm here, let me just bring up the revision book has something that looks like this, where and this is just a very, very rough first draft, but where for all the topics, there's a learning outcome, and then it has the example for students. This will be in the very beginning of the chapter for the biological approach, and also a quick summary of the key studies that students need to use. So everything here is broken down in the revision textbook, which will be coming out October, November 20, what year are we? 2018? Yeah. So in a couple of months, that will be ready. Okay, now in the guide it says the value of animal models in psychology research. So that's the statement. Plus, whether animal research can provide insight into human behavior. To me, they don't both need to be there. The value of animal models is that they can provide insight into human behavior. And so that's what we're looking at. So the value, and this again is taken straight from my first draft of my revision book. The value of animal models is they can provide insight into localization of function and how damage to that brain may affect behavior. here are our studies, and as much as possible I'm trying to use studies here that can be used in the core and the other questions as well to reduce the content. And we can see even things like Sapolsky can be used across 2 different topics. And again, so I mean, the value of these animals can provide insight into their behavior, and then the essay, the counter argument is just, well, to what extent, right? And that's the whether part, right? So okay, to what extent? So then we just counter argue, can they really? Okay, now studying criminology with the biological approach with criminology. So yeah, the unit I've put together, and you can find on our website and our store, covers everything in the biological approach except for pheromones. That comes in our love and marriage topic, although I'm sure you could find pheromones linked to aggression, perhaps. Yeah. So if you're doing a linear approach, typically what that's meant in the past is you just go through the topics as they appear in the guide. You just go through it in a line, right? So, okay, that one, and then you just, the behaviors are all pretty random. So you might look at localization of the hippocampus and memory, and then hormones on seasonal affective disorder, and then neurotransmission and depression. So you're looking at a whole bunch of different behaviors with these different biological factors, right? And then we think, okay, how do we know, and looking at genetics as well. So that would be how you'd go about a linear approach. The thematic approach, or also known as, you could talk about if it was a holistic approach, maybe, actually, no, sorry, thematic approach would be, all right, my behavior, my theme is going to be one behavior, the same behavior, right, criminal behavior, or it could be aggression or violence, whatever. You say, that's my theme, and then I'm going to have all these topics build on that same behavior. Now, this to me is an improvement because it's easier for students to think about just one behavior than every topic a new behavior we're introducing, and they're building their understanding of one behavior. Plus, they can use all of these things as counter arguments for one another in essays. And you also might, so this is where the integrated or holistic approach comes in, where you say, well, it's not just biological, it's also cultural, social cultural factors and cognition. And I think that's really important. We don't want students to think, all right, we don't want to end the biological approach, I think, by saying, oh, man, our behavior is all affected by our biology. We want them to finish the course thinking, all right, biology plays a part, but so does our childhood, so does our environment, so does our culture, so does the way we think. So we can look at a whole bunch of things here. So this is more what the thematic or holistic approach looks like. Now, the thematic, this is a word I made up that describes a bit of a model of curriculum. But what we're looking at here is the same kind of idea that we are, because to keep it simple for students, and we've all got a range of students, we're looking at, here's a topic, here's the factor, and here's how to fix the behavior. But then we go deeper, and this is where we allow our students who are really capable of, those that we know get 5s and 6s, they could be getting 6s and 7s, we allow them to go deeper without adding too much new content. So I might say, all right, the brain affects behavior, but the testosterone affects the brain, which affects behavior. Testosterone affects the prefrontal cortex, which affects our thinking, which affects behavior. The culture of honor can affect our hormones, which affects us. And so it gets a little slightly more intricate as the topics progress. And then we see here, right, so yeah, serotonin affects the brain, affects behavior. But genetics can affect serotonin, which affects the brain, affects behavior. Okay, and so we can see here, right, so if we know we've got this damage to the brain, but then also that the structure and the function of the brain can change. So this is, now if you're a first year teacher, this might be a little bit overwhelming, and I would say take it easy and work within your comfort zone, or work slightly beyond your comfort zone. And you might want to tackle this later on. But I like this approach because I think it's more fun, it's more interesting, and I think it's a better way to teach psychology, that we're not just saying it's biology, we're not looking at promoting a reductionist view, but we're saying, look, the bottom line is, it's complicated. It's complex. As Sapolsky says in his TED Talk, all these things are interacting, but any one behavior cannot be reduced to one simple explanation. And if students finish the criminology unit a little bit complicated, a little bit confused, going, man, there's so much going on. Well, that's the reality of human behavior, is that it's complicated. And also we know, okay, if we understand origins or the root causes of behavior, maybe we can design better preventions and treatments. And that comes back again in the PTSD unit as well. And yeah, so I mean, this is essentially it. And this is the same conceptual understandings that go through a lot of the units in the course that we want to teach, right? So we go, well, behavior is complicated, and if we understand causes, then we can develop better treatments, and maybe we can prevent those causes from happening to begin with. Now, if have a look at the Criminology pack if you haven't already yet. There's a link in the description for that one. That's got everything there that you need to start. The unit plan, the workbooks, PowerPoints. It's got everything there that you need to teach criminology, as well as a few of the textbook extracts. So I'm just going to predict this here. I'm not going to read these out because that would be tiresome. But I think these would be good short answer questions. And so if you're trying to come up with a mock exam or test or something, then you can come back to this video and have a look at this. Is what I think would be the most likely questions to be asked. I think they're the most legitimate, but again, this is just my interpretation. Now, if you want to make that into an essay, I would just change this to discuss. Right? Now, yeah, the other ones could be to what extent does neurotransmission affect human behavior, or hormone, pheromone, or genetics? But I think, yeah, these are the basic phrases I think will appear. Now, just this little note to remind myself, what will be on the exam, headings or subheadings? We've been told that after next year, so from 2020, it won't just be the topics, so it won't just be hormones and behavior, but it could be all that sub-description that you would find in the guide, excuse me. I wouldn't teach to that. I think if we're going to try and teach to that, we're going to drown our course in content and make it so hard for our students to do well. I would just be teaching to the key questions that I put on this webinar that I identified for each topic. That's what I'm going to be doing, because if I start trying to teach everything in the guide, like suddenly looking at agonists and antagonists and how they might affect behavior, or how genetics can affect neuroplasticity, then what I'm doing is I'm bending over backwards to accommodate a poor curriculum outline from the IB, and that's just jeopardizing my course and my students' enjoyment of psychology, and I think ultimately their ability to do well on the exams. I'm taking a massive gamble. I would be taking a massive gamble by throwing all that content in that probably won't be asked on the exam. So why would I do that? And that's just, maybe that's renegade, maybe that's too arrogant, but I do have faith in the assessment team that they will ask fair questions, and I think there's been enough brouhaha about the problems with the guide that the assessment team will make up for that. And I think it's important to know that the people that wrote the guide are not the same people that will write the assessments. They're two different people. They often don't talk to each other. Two different, one's in Cardiff, one group's in Cardiff, one's in The Hague. So I think that's an important thing to know as well. That if it was people who wrote the guide would write the exams, maybe I'd be worried. The fact they're two different camps, I'm okay. Okay, I think all the topics state one or more. This means that they may just state one. Now, they won't say two because it says one or more. So you've always got the choice to do one. I would always have one in depth. What I mean by that is one or more effects of neurotransmitters. When studying for the exam, tell students, take one neurotransmitter. Because if they've skimmed over heaps, I think it's going to be harder to write like a short answer response. And especially, if it says one or more, those that have gone in depth and can really explain serotonin, for example, and its effect on aggression, will be more prepared. And they'll show everything that they know. Now, I've said they shouldn't ask for two. They won't. It says one or more in the guide, but so they shouldn't. You can teach a biological approach in the options. That's another good tip. So if you're not doing the thematic approach, then what you'll find is you're naturally doing the bio topics in the options. And so one approach could be just do the options first. Do abnormal psychology. Start with that. And then you'll find, oh, actually, I just taught the genes, and genes is a cause of depression. Now you don't have to teach genes. Or when you get to the biological approach, you just teach the same topic, genes and depression. Again, you go, hey, remember we did that? And now we're just going to review it. So I think you can start with the options first if you like, because you're naturally going to cover some of the core. Just quickly, I think before we start these topics, we want to have a real sense of purpose of why we're teaching it. I like teaching criminology because I don't want students to look at people who do bad things and go, they're evil, something needs to be done with them. I'd rather them to think a little bit more beyond that and go, all right, that's a problem. The person did that, but why did they do it? You know, not judging the outcome, but thinking more about the root causes of things, and how can we make society a better place? How can we help those people that are committing those crimes, or can we help those people that are committing those crimes? And if we can't, what do we do about them? And again, realizing that it's a complex issue. So that's what I would say. And also, if the biological approach, so it can help us understand empathy, develop empathy, if we know why these people are doing this horrible stuff because of things completely out of their control, like how they were treated as a kid. And then, right, so we can develop some empathy there. And also, if we know the origins, again, we can develop the treatments and the strategies. I won't thrash that dead horse. Okay, so just a real quick review. So we're finished up here. I'm right on 55 minutes, a few minutes longer than I wanted to. How and why does biology affect behavior? I think that's probably the central question that dictates the biological approach. And then we look at neuroplasticity. We know that it interacts, so our behavior can actually also affect our biology. And how do we know? 3 real simple questions that guide the biological approach. I really hope that webinar was helpful. And you know, yeah, and you got something out of it. What I would suggest is, if you're struggling, don't feel like you're struggling through this by yourself. There's heaps of people who want to help out and know what it's like to be just starting. Subscribe, join our Facebook group, and send messages. And you know, I'll be keeping on releasing videos and things that should be helpful. Our store's always got free previews and downloads and things that might help you out. And yeah, again, hope that helped. Good luck, keep your head up, and just keep swimming. All right, cheers.